I fell asleep as a woman in sweatpants and a hoodie, the kind of tired you get from doom scrolling until 2 in the morning, and woke up 5 months pregnant in a silk-draped bed. Normal Tuesday, right? The first thing I registered was the weight, the slow, steady gravity of something that belonged to me but felt foreign, like a borrowed book with someone else's handwriting in the margins. My hand went to my belly before my brain had caught up. It was round and warm, a small, stubborn planet beneath the sheet. I blinked at the wooden beams above me, thick, dark, smelling faintly of an attic trunk and boiled herbs. And for one ridiculous, lucid second, I thought I must have fallen asleep reading on the couch. Then the memories hit like a download. The blur of clickable chapters I had binged the night before, the way the protagonist's life had been a series of gentle betrayals, the specific chapter titles flashing in my skull, the poisoned tea, bloom of a fallen flower, the general's grief, Fan Jensen, Fani. The name landed like a stone into still water and rippled into something more dangerous. I was Fani. I had woken inside a web novel I'd read until my eyes blurred. The kind of ancient BL romance that starts soft and ends with tragedy because someone always misunderstands a gesture at the wrong time. Panic is a physical thing. It's not the neat, cinematic gasp. It's 1,000 small betrayals. The world tilting as your stomach lurches, a heat flushing your face, the pressure behind your ribs. I sat up too quickly and felt a flicker of nausea like a memory of pregnancy that belonged to someone else. A kick answered, small and impatient, as if the child inside wanted to remind me we were both present and panicked. Thank you very much. The room was minimal in the way of a house that understands it should be efficient rather than pretty. A low table, a basin, a narrow wardrobe where a single silk robe hung. Beside the bed, on a tray, an earthenware cup of something herbal steamed faintly. Someone had left a folded note on the pillow. My fingers shook as I smoothed it open. Fan Jensen. Do not leave the East Wing unattended. The General returns tomorrow. Ching Shu. The memory of a quiet servant, loyal, watchful, the kind of friend a protagonist usually gets to keep in the background until the villain sharpens their teeth, pulled at the edges of my sanity. Tomorrow? The General returns tomorrow? I had read that the original Fani had been left alone, trusting until Miss Lin, stepsister, smile like glass, had gilded betrayal with tea. The original ending had him collapsing in the corridor, breath fluttering out like a candle no one thought to shield. I propped myself up on pillows and found a small mirror on the dressing table. The face looking back at me was familiar enough. Soft jaw, lashes dusted with shadow, but not mine. My hair, tied into a loose knot, revealed a nape I had not owned hours earlier. My hand moved to the jade pendant resting against my collarbone, smooth and cool. The pendant was an object meant to denote family and status here. In a meta-sense, it was also the kind of prop a narrative loved to tug when it wanted to remind you of your predetermined place. Every single thing in me screamed that this was impossible. Then a hiccup of logic. I had read the novel. I knew the beats. I also knew that the novel's Fani was described as headstrong in private but publicly gullible, betrayed by love and by those who smiled the prettiest. The outline of the original plot was a skeleton I knew too well. If the General returned tomorrow and the stepsister plotted with the midwife and the physician took gold for silence, then my entire life, all 5 months of the child I'm carrying, was teetering on a ledge someone had written down before I even opened my eyes. Rewrite your fate, my brain said, because apparently surviving a fictional death requires project management. I stood, careful, feeling the stretch of a belly. Walking across the room, I found clothes laid out, a robe, wide-sleeved and pale as peeling moonlight, and beneath it, softer garments for warmth. No signs of weaponry, which was consistent with being a character who survived by being seen as fragile rather than by fisticuffs. I dressed slowly, each movement a negotiation with muscles that felt both mine and not. The house creaked like pages turning. Good morning, Ching Shu said, appearing like a sound in the wall. She was smaller than I expected, but with hands that held themselves as if they had learned restraint. capable of both steadying a teacup and watching a doorway for hours on end. Her expression when she saw me was a careful kind of relief, like someone who had sat through a storm hoping a roof would hold. "You're awake," she said, and there was no pity in it. Pity is the kind of thing villains weaponize in novels. Observational care is safer. "You had a troubled night?" "You could say that." My voice came out thinner than I wanted. "What day is it?" "5th day of the 7th moon." She waited the polite beat. "The general will arrive tomorrow morning. Miss Lin prepares the East Pavilion to receive him. The midwife checks on your health each morning. The physicians leave at dusk." Her neat factual sentences were a map. Tomorrow, East Pavilion. Midwife at dawn, physicians at dusk. All places of potential poison. All times when a cup could change a life. I felt ridiculous, like a woman who knew too many spoilers for a show she'd watched 5 minutes ago. Yet every chapter's pattern was a codex for danger. "If you're wondering how I know about poisoning, it's because I read the chapters," I said. Because confession felt healthier than pretending I'd been born into plot armor. I bit the inside of my cheek. I know what happens to me in the original story. Qing Shu's eyes widened fractionally. She was not the type to show shock, and yet here it was. Contained, bright, interested instead of frightened. "You are Fan Jensen, then," she said. "You have always felt a different heart." The intonation in her voice could have been read as sympathy, curiosity, or the concentrated attention of someone who takes the affairs of their household personally. Qing Shu had been background in the book. The friend who stayed. In reality, she was a potential ally, and I needed allies like someone needed oxygen. "Did Miss Lin drink with you often?" I asked. A practical question. "Occasionally. She brings fruit and tea. She is attentive when the general approaches." Qing Shu's mouth made a small line. "She does not like to be contradicted." That was Miss Lin in a sentence, charming with a fist hidden in a lace glove. I felt my chest tighten. I could imagine the smile that would fold into a knife. "We have to change how people see me," I said, louder than I intended. The word surprised me, this voice decisive and quick to file strategies. If everyone expects me to be a fragile, trusting victim, then the safest path is to appear fragile enough to pull the general's concern but shrewd enough to avoid the setups. I can't be the same person the book made me. Qing Shu watched me, the lamplight catching in her pupils. "That is wise," she said. "And as a servant in a household where a general's favor could mean a roof or exile, wisdom matters." We made a plan in fragments that morning, which was the only way sane plans ever form in stories where time is a knife. First, stay visible. Isolation was the original Fani's enemy. I'd make sure people saw me enough that anyone plotting would hesitate. Second, cultivate the general's attention without appearing to scheme. Desperation smells like a target. Gratitude smells like necessity. Third, test the food and the cups carefully, but without doing something that would make Miss Lin suspect. Fourth, gather evidence wherever possible. Bribes, secret letters, the face of the physician who doesn't look at you when he speaks. Qing Shu proved to be a walking repository of small household secrets. She knew which servants left early and who returned late. She could read the general's pattern from the set of his boots by the door. She showed me the midwife's ledger and where the physicians kept their small brass box for fees. "They think we sleep," she said. "But people always move when the night is theirs. We will watch with night lamps." There's a kind of absurdity in creating strategy in another person's life. An audition in front of an audience that expects you to hit marks already written. But rehearsal beats panic. I practiced the fragile smile that made people lean in. I practiced the soft cough that made hands hover. I practiced looking up at the general with unguarded, watery gratitude. I felt ridiculous doing it, but the child inside kicked like a small elbow of encouragement. I had half a mind to apologize to my past self, the version of me who binged until dawn and never expected to be summoned into fictional danger. "Sorry," I muttered into the cotton of the robe. This synthesis of sleeping and reading has been more literal than I thought. The first trial came quicker than I'd planned. Miss Lynn offered me soup that afternoon, a delicate bowl smelling of ginger and something sweet. Her smile was designed with expert care. It curved like a crescent moon and never quite reached the eyes. "You must eat," she said, the tone warm as honey. "The general will be reunited with his household tomorrow. Strength is necessary for celebrations." I remembered the way the original Fani had accepted similar kindness with a childlike trust, and paid for it with his life. My fingers circled the rim of the bowl as if to warm them. In 100 tiny ways, this world exposed itself like a test paper: posture, eye contact, the hand that reached for a ladle. I nodded at Miss Lynn, took the spoon, and only brought it to my lips after a beat that felt like a heartbeat stretched thin. "It's delicious," I said, because my throat had ached for an ally. I took a bite and set the spoon down. I left the bowl half full. Miss Lynn blinked, and in that split second I read the calculation behind her smile. The soup was fine. She had expected me to eat with more abandon. Perhaps of all the tricks in this bookish life, the simplest was the most powerful. A refusal to be wholly gullible changes the way predators choose their points of attack. Miss Lynn's expression softened into a shade that said, "Maybe I misread you." She whispered something about tender care, touched my sleeve with something like pity, and then set the bowl aside as if she had performed a ritual duty. Outside the curtains, a guard's boots thudded against the courtyard stones. I felt oddly triumphant, as if I'd passed an exam for which no one had warned me. That night, when the house grew thin-lipped with the hush of sleeping people, I lay awake and catalogued the small wins. I had shown restraint. I had baited suspicion. I had not yet made a true move against Miss Lynn. This was chess played in teacups and touches, but the board was alive beneath my hands. The child kicked, a reminder that this was not merely a self-preservation project. It was a small, beating life that needed me to be clever enough to survive. When you know the plot, you can also see where chance might help. But I was careful not to rely on luck. In the chapters I had devoured last night, the general was a study in contradictions, cold and exacting in public, capable of a tenderness that surprised anyone too distracted to look. My reading had revealed something else too. A single scene where the general, returning earlier than expected, placed his hand on Fani's belly by accident and found himself arrested by the presence of another human life. It was the kind of small image that a novel uses to change a man's direction. If I could engineer that small accident, without making it look like manipulation, then the general's attention might shift from the world away from Fani's useless tendency toward blind trust, and toward the tangible fact of a child. A child is a claim no noble can easily dismiss. But manufacturing a moment where a man of honor touches your belly without it looking like a calculated ploy was delicate work. You couldn't shove hands into the general's palm and call it fate. That was the small strategy I practiced for days. The accidental lean, the stumbled step that brought my body against his sleeve in public, the way a moan of pain could be discreetly muffled into a cough that made someone near enough bend. I practiced being grateful in public and private. Gratitude is an attractive alloy. It bends suspicion into protectiveness in a way I'd never believed until I saw it happen. On the third morning, a message arrived. The general would return earlier than expected. Xinyan. Xinyan. The name resonated like a drum. When he appeared atop the steps, he looked exactly as the book had described him. A built-in austerity, an expression not meant for hobbies. His robes were severe but well cut. His gaze was the kind that divided a person into useful and not. He did not sweep through the courtyard with fanfare. He arrived with the economy of a man who has lived at the center of commands. When he entered the East Pavilion, where we were meant to receive him, I remembered every chapter that had ever described him looking at Fani with a sort of complicated calculation. He stopped at the carved wooden screen, as if listening to the air for confession, and then, as if drawn by an invisible thread or perhaps by my very deliberate smallness, his steps took him closer to where I sat. I kept my hands in my lap, trying to make my breathing as ordinary as possible while everything inside felt like a drum roll. He looked at me long enough that my muscles learned to be still. In that look was distance but also curiosity, a small fissure in armor. He did not address me immediately, He addressed the household with orders crisp as black-tipped arrows. Yet when the moment came that forced him to move close, when I pretended carefully to have stumbled on a rug and leaned against a column, he did not step away. Instead, he steadied me, his hand falling to the small of my back as if it were an old practiced motion. The contact was plain and practical, but it carried with it a warmth that surprised me, a recognition that the body in front of him was not merely a prop. "Are you unwell?" he asked, voice deep and calibrated as if measuring a scale. "A momentary weakness," I said, keeping the practiced softness. "I am fine now." I allowed myself to be supported, letting my head tilt so that the line of his shoulder and the curve of my belly aligned. He glanced down, just a flick, and something passed through his face. Interest. Unexpressed, yes, but undeniable. My heart thudded as if victory could be measured in 2 quick beats. Later, when servants spoke in corridors, the rumor did not form into gossip about weakness. They spoke instead of how the general had paused, had asked about well-being. In small societies where honor matters, the act of asking is already a kind of shield. My staged clumsiness had yielded almost what I'd hoped, an attention that could be turned into insistence on protection without appearing hungry for it. Still, danger had not been neutralized. Miss Lynn smiled at me with the same patient moon-silver grin, but now there was a flicker of calculation I had not seen before. If I was altering the script, she was too. That was inevitable. The house felt like a web in which 2 spiders had learned new steps. The midwife came every morning, an earnest woman with hands that smelled of dried herbs and of steady mornings. She checked my pulse, took down notes, hummed tunelessly while she did the practical business of ensuring a child's arrival. The physicians visited at dusk and never stayed long in my presence. Their eyes skimmed over symptom lists. Their hands performed the ritual of expertise. One of them lingered longer than the rest, and I watched how his gaze slid to a small brass box the physicians kept by the bedside. The brass box was the kind of detail that a novel loves to gloss over, bribes and hush money tucked away like a sin saved for later. Ching Shu and I began collecting little things: a scrap of paper, a coin smudged with ink, a physician's name casually dropped in a servant's complaint. We made lists in the margins of the house, threading observations like beads. It felt strangely childish and fiercely adult at once, like building a fortress from hairpins and glue. I told myself that evidence would be the best way to rewrite destiny, expose the rot openly and force the household to respond with justice rather than gossip. The more we watched, the more the small pattern revealed itself. Physicians who took payments and looked downward, an errand boy who delivered goods to a nameless house across the canal, Miss Lynn's hand guiding conversations away from the general's attention and toward the general's gratitude to those who kept his home in order. She performed virtue as an occupation. Virtue is a persuasive kind of lie. And then there were nights when the child kicked with a force that made me laugh aloud in bed, a small, joyful violence. There is an intimacy to knowing a tiny life is contained within you. It changes the calculus. Survival is no longer selfish. It becomes lineated like a sentence that contains someone else's name halfway through. The child pushed against me when I imagined the loneliness of a mother buried by a plot. I had not expected tenderness to arrive en route to cunning, but tenderness arrived anyway, soft, insistent, rewriting me from the inside. On the 4th morning, Miss Lynn arrived bearing a wrapped parcel and the same smile she had perfected. She placed the parcel into my hands with the kind of attention that meant she had rehearsed generosity. "Something for the child," she murmured. I felt a prickle. Hands too practiced, eyes too kind. I could have declined, but refusing kindness is sometimes a show of boldness and sometimes the quickest way to make a villain obvious. I opened the parcel. Inside lay a swaddling cloth embroidered with delicate cranes and the faint scent of lotus water. It was beautiful and also an obvious signal to the household. "I have thought of your child." Miss Lynn's offering had the double edge of public placation and private intimacy. "Thank you," I said genuinely. It was a gift a child would need. But as I hugged the cloth to my chest, I made a decision. I would test her, not aggressively, but with the lightness of a person who knows their lines and is not afraid to change them. I would make sure that every kindness earned was deserving. That afternoon, Miss Lin invited me to the East Pavilion, where she proposed a small tea ceremony to prepare for the general's return. The invitation felt deliberate. The East Pavilion was where the general would first see his household. It was also where a cup could change a lifetime. I accepted because not going would look suspicious, and suspicion is a faster blade than any cup of poison. As I dressed, my stomach a steady, gentle weight. I thought of the plan we had made in whispers under the eaves. I would accept food in ways that showed gratitude, but not greed. I would never drink alone when Miss Lin was present. I would make a small show of tasting and then setting food aside. I would keep my hands visible. I would ask someone to retrieve a small item from the next room if I wished to leave the table for a moment, creating the chance for guardedness. Most importantly, I would keep watching. When I entered the pavilion, Miss Lin rose, smile already tuned to the room. The servants arranged like a chorus behind her. The table was set with porcelain bowls, steam curling from them like white flags. Ching Shu sat at my side, her eyes luminous with the quiet courage of someone who understands danger at the level of muscle memory. Miss Lin poured tea with a movement so smooth it might have been carved from river stone. "To new beginnings," she said without a lie in her voice. The tea smelled floral and innocent. I lifted my cup, because to refuse would be to invite scrutiny. I brought the rim to my lips, and then, as if remembering a gesture I had practiced in the stillness of my room, I set it back and said, "If you will forgive me, I must walk in the garden before our celebration. The air is good for the child." Miss Lin's smile flickered in a scheduling of micro-expressions I had only begun to catalog. "Of course," she said, "a short stroll is wise." Outside, the garden was a careful thing. Paths like written lines and trees pruned to speak only in silhouettes. I walked slow, each step an argument against the quickness of panic. My heart felt absurdly loud. I kept thinking of the original Fani, naive and trusting, and of the way novels treat small differences as determinations. I did not want to be the line that reads, "And then nothing could change." When I returned to the pavilion, Miss Lin had rearranged the cushions as if to claim the most elegant seat. Her hand hovered near the tea service, as if to insinuate that any future cup would be hers to control. Ching Shu gave me a small look, one of those looks that holds an entire plan in its eyes. She handed me a small porcelain bowl under the table legibly, without attracting attention, the bowl containing nothing but a pinch of salt. It was a silent ritual between us. The salt would prove nothing chemically, but its presence was a gesture, a signal that we were aligned. We returned to the table and Miss Lin poured another cup, this time with the kind of flourish that is practiced in drawing rooms where cameras do not exist, but attention is currency. She raised her own cup and said something about health and grace. I drank a small sip, exactly enough to honor the social performance. The tea tasted like papers and petals. Nothing gnawed at the back of my throat, no burning, no sudden dizziness. Miss Lin watched me as if she found my restraint both a puzzle and a betrayal. It occurred to me then that the act of not being the person they wrote me to be was, in itself, a kind of power. The original script had a character who accepted and suffered in silence, who had virtues without armor. The new compact I had signed with myself meant virtues with a visor, soft, yes, but visible. When the general arrived later that day, earlier than anyone expected, he found me sitting with my hand on my belly, the embroidered cloth folded across my knees. He stood in the doorway like a clean edge. People fell into a hush. Miss Lin moved forward with a greeting rehearsed to the degree that strangers could mistake it for sincerity. The general's expression was unreadable as always, professional to the last. But then a small thing happened that set my world on a tilt that was not fatal. A guest bumped the table, sending a bowl teetering. I reached out without thinking and steadied it. My elbow brushed the general's sleeve in a manner that, if one were generous, could be read as clumsy, and if one were less generous, could be written in a book as fate making contact. He did not pull away. His hand rested on the table, and the warmth of his palm near my hip felt like an area of quiet I had not expected to claim. He asked simply, "How fares the child?" The question cut through the room like rain through a roof. I told the truth. The child is well. I placed my hand flat on my belly in a gesture that in fiction and in reality makes claims visible and human. His gaze lingered, and something like comprehension softened the lines around his eyes. That night I lay awake and thought about how a man's attention does not magically transform into loyalty, but it shifts the ledger. The household's calculations changed just enough that Miss Lynn's moves now had to account for this new variable, a general whose gaze had lingered. Whether that gaze would manifest as protection or as a different kind of instrument, I did not yet know. All I knew was that the armor the book had given him included space for tenderness, where someone was patient enough to wait. The days that followed folded into a rhythm, careful conversations, rehearsed vulnerability, small experiments with visibility and gratitude. We gathered evidence. A physician's late-night visit to a vendor in the market, a package passed under cloak, a ledger entry with sums paid and names left blank. Ching Shu took these findings to me in the privacy of the servants' corridor, her hand steady as she passed me the slips like contraband. When we found the physician's name tied to a house where Miss Lynn had once hosted games, an address with a courtesan's lamp in the doorway, my stomach tightened into a knot that felt like fear and triumph braided together. Evidence is not a weapon that kills on the spot, but it is a lever. One day, I told myself, we would pry the lid off the story that had been written for me and show the household the rot within. And yet, despite plans and small victories, there were nights when panic returned with teeth renewed. I would wake with the sound of my own breath loud as a drum and think of that one chapter, where the general returned to a house already broken and found nothing save a folded body and a stolen child. Sometimes I imagined Miss Lynn already having set her smile across my lips. I would touch my belly and feel small, fierce, protective. The child answered back with a soft push, like fists against a cardboard wall, as if to say, "Remember, we are here." On the 5th morning, Ching Shu brought me a note and a look that was part warning, part eagerness. Miss Lynn would be bringing soup again that afternoon. "And?" I asked. "And," Ching Shu said, lowering her voice, "she will not bring it to the dining hall. She will bring it to the rear pavilion, where it is said the breeze is better for expecting mothers." Her words had the coolness of a map revealing a trap. The rear pavilion was small, a place where a cup could be slipped unnoticed, where a physician could whisper. Miss Lynn's choice of location felt purposeful and private. She was escalating, testing different arenas. The fact that she had chosen the rear pavilion, a quieter, less observed corner, meant either overconfidence or an intention to strike where fewer witnesses existed. I felt the old novel's dread coiling at the base of my throat, but the new plan had more teeth than simple fright. "We will go," I said, "and we will not go alone." My voice did not wobble. It was a line delivered in a play because the actor had chosen to be brave. Ching Shu nodded, as if the decision had been the only possible one. "Guards will be nearby," she said, "and I will ask the midwife to come early under the pretense of monitoring. If Miss Lynn attempts anything, we will have witnesses and records." There is a point in any good plan where the theoretical becomes reality. The rear pavilion was shaded and fragrant that afternoon, walls of lattice catching the light in patterns. Miss Lynn arrived with the same smile and a porcelain bowl steam-curled at the rim. She offered it to me like an ally proffering solace. "If you're wondering, this is the moment where everything that's been built will be tested. This is the hour where a spoon trembles over a bowl and a life can change." I set my hand on the bowl as if to accept, but before I could lift it, Ching Shu cleared her throat softly and said to no one in particular, "The midwife thinks it wise to check the broth that has been brewed hours before any of us eat. Strange airs move in recent nights." Miss Lynn's smile was a practice thing. For the first time I saw clearly the play in her eyes that matched the scripts I had consumed. She tilted her chin in mild disdain, and for a breath the pavilion felt like a stage where two actresses faced off for the same applause. "It is a sensible precaution," Miss Lynn said, eyes flicking to mine. "We would not want risk." "Yes," I said, and in my voice there was a quiet that was not acted. "We would not." Shu stepped forward and asked Miss Lin lightly if she would allow the bowl to be tested. Miss Lin's hands were micro-fascinating. The slightest motion betrayed a thought crossing her face. Suspicion, quickly covered. She agreed with a tilt. The midwife, called under the offer of a health check, arrived within a moment, humming. She took a sip, and then another, and declared, performed, the broth safe. A bland herbal mix, good for digestion, she said. I watched Miss Lin as if my eyes were the only thing that could read her like a script. She murmured something about being cautious, and then, here is the piece I will not forget. She lifted a second cup, titled it in the sunlight, and with a flicker of practiced ease, tasted it as if it were the same as the first. In that twitch, an unfixed answer asked itself, had she been confident because she had already used a different method elsewhere, or confident because she had simply not dared try on herself? The midwife's approval was not a verdict. It was a performance, and a performance can be bribed or honed through persuasion. My eyes narrowed fractionally. Miss Lin sat down and spoke of the general with a sweetness that made the pavilion smell of perfumed paper. The moment had passed, or had it merely shifted into a new shape? Shu and I left the pavilion with the embroidered cloth folded over my arm. We walked through the garden where the air felt like an held breath. She changed the arena, Shu whispered. That is a step toward something dangerous. Then we change with her, I said. We keep moving every time she picks a new stage. We did not know then that Miss Lin had been watching our small performance from the corner of her smile, with a calculation that would soon find more teeth. We only knew what we always knew. The story we had been given had enemies, and enemies could be made to reveal themselves with cunning and witnesses. We had witnessed soup tasted twice. We had placed the midwife in the room. We had a list of behaviors and a compass pointing toward suspicious houses. That afternoon our list grew. A servant who had been absent returned with dirt on his shoes and a furtive look that banks misplace when they lose a coin. In the ledger we found a notation. A name in the physician's hand written in a shorthand I had learned to read for what it meant. Payment. We folded the note and hid it beneath the board of the wardrobe, where small things whisper less loudly than they scream. Night came with a thin sky. I lay by the window and watched the moon lean like a sickle over the house. The child turned into me as if to reassure itself. It is one thing to plan for your own survival. It is a different kind of terror and joy to plan for another person whose only currency is trust in you. My plans felt larger than I expected, not cunning for its own sake, but cunning used to fold a small life into safety. The next morning I was awake before dawn. The house hummed in the low, contained way of people who do not expect surprises. I dressed and moved like a person who had rehearsed where her feet would fall. At the door, Shu's face had a question in it, and in her clear gaze I saw what I would later call the first turning of a tide. She will bring soup again today, she said. I laughed once, short and incredulous. Miss Lin is either extremely devoted to our well-being or extremely bad at hiding her preferences. Shu did not laugh. She brings soup in the rear pavilion again, but she called for the midwife to be delayed. She sent the physician away on errands. The information dropped into my stomach like a stone. The net had been set for the same place. The midwife scheduled for delay made it clear. Miss Lin wanted fewer witnesses. The physician's errand was a chess move. She was rearranging the board to her advantage. We could have avoided the pavilion. We could have made Miss Lin's absence a social slight that had consequences. We could have reported her. Or we could test her directly, in the way that a person who had read the novel and then refused to be a victim might. I tuned my voice to its calmest pitch. Then we make the midwife come, I said. We ask the general himself to see to it. Shu's eyes widened. The general? The general will be here today, I said. He came early before. If we can make him aware that Miss Lin is orchestrating times when witnesses are thin, then he will have to act. The physician cannot be the one to go missing without the general noticing. We need him to know a pattern is forming. Shu's mouth thinned. That requires the general to be convinced. Then we ensure he has reason to be, I said. We make a visible concern where he cannot ignore it. We do not accuse. We make the pattern impossible to overlook. There are moments when plan feels like faith. Faith not in gods but in the tide of human decency. I had to believe that a man like Xinyan, upon seeing a repeated pattern designed to isolate and endanger his family, would act. If the book had left him a statue, perhaps I could make him a man with decisions to make. The child inside me thumped a small affirmation. Sometimes the best plans get their authority from little, violent things. As the sun reached its middle, I began to prepare. I would not risk my life or the child's for heroics, but I would not be left to become the anthology footnote that the original novel insisted I be. We had made enough small holes in the script to breathe. We would now use each small hole as a trumpet. When Miss Lin arrived at the rear pavilion that afternoon, the air between us tasted like copper. She smiled, and I smiled back. Not fragile but measured, like someone holding a blade who intends never to show it. She offered the porcelain bowl with the same elegant flourish. This time the midwife was present, early as requested by a servant who happened upon her on the path. The pavilion had more witnesses than it had the day before. Miss Lin's eyes flicked over our faces, and for the first time since I woke up in this story, I felt something like the plot bending under the weight of deliberate choices. She set the bowl before me. I reached for it like a person who had rehearsed restraint down to a muscle. My hand hovered, and the general's silhouette appeared in the doorway as if he had been summoned by the sound of a tide. He did not move like a man following a stage direction. He arrived with the unglamour of someone who had been called. His face was as impassive as stone, but when he looked at me there was a kindling of interest that might become action. Miss Lin smiled at him, too sweetly perhaps, but the gaze she offered was a calculation I had already catalogued. She could never be subtle, I realized. Her charm had always been an instrument with a distinct edge. The pavilion felt small with all the witnesses present. The midwife hovered. The servants watched in constrained lines. Qing Shu's hand rested near mine as if mere contact could be a line of defense. Miss Lin's bowl steamed lightly. The moment a person plans for your demise by tea is also the moment you get better at seeing the art of their terror. Intentions leave fingerprints on gestures. As I lifted the bowl to my lips, I felt something entirely different than fear. I felt the grown-up certainty of someone who had felt the grown-up certainty of someone who had rehearsed bravery until it fit like a second skin. I brought the rim to my lips and tasted nothing dramatic, just tea, slightly sweet, like paper left in afternoon sun. The pavilion hummed with ordinary sounds. A servant's sleeve brushed a cushion. The midwife rearranged her satchel. Qing Shu's breathing was a steady presence at my side. Miss Lin watched me as if parsing the moment for future scripts. When I set the cup down, her smile had a fine crack along the edge. "You grow more careful each day," she said, voice silk. "It does a child good to have a thoughtful mother." "Thank you," I said and meant it. The embroidered cloth rested in my lap like a flag. Outside, a breeze threaded through the lattice, carrying the faint, honest smell of cut grass. The tea had been safe. Either Miss Lin had been thwarted, or she had not been as bold as her posture suggested. Either way, we had bought time, and in a household where days stack like tiles, time is often the sharpest weapon. The general lingered for a breath longer than the politeness required. He asked about the midwife, about provisions, about the physicians. His questions were not prying in the malicious way of gossip. They were professional, contained. Yet the act of asking summoned attention from other corners of the house. Someone would now account for nights away and for the small fees buried in brass boxes. After the pavilion, the household changed its rhythm as if a bell had been rung. Servants walked with a little more care. Physicians checked off their rounds with smaller steps. Miss Lin moved like a woman carrying a secret and pretending the weight was an embroidered shawl. The ledger we'd hidden beneath the wardrobe board felt like a pulse beneath the floor. Quiet, necessary, dangerous. That evening, Qing Shu pressed a scrap into my palm in the dark corridors, a note that smelled faintly of the market. "The physician will visit the house across the canal tonight," she said, whispering as if the walls had ears. "A house with paper lanterns and a lamp that burns blue at the windows." The name on the slip matched the shorthand in the ledger, a house with a courtesan's lamp. The pieces I had found, the physician's late visits, the mysterious payments, the errands, were aligning into something brittle and clear. We had been collecting suggestions, now we had something that looked like motive and direction. We did not act rashly. Rewriting a fate is not the same as overturning a table. Chaos could make everything worse. Instead, I did something far less romantic. I wrote. I collected everything in a single thin paper folded into a quiet map. Dates, names, times, servants who had been present. I described with as much care as I could muster the pattern of absences and the names that connected like dots. I folded the packet and slipped it within the lining of the jade pendant at my collar, so that it felt for a moment as if fate had been made into jewelry. The next morning, the general summoned the physicians to a meeting in the East Hall. They came, robe hems whispering, faces careful like men who have kept too many secrets. I did not attend the meeting. Instead, I did what I could do best. I stayed present where people could see me, in the center of small domestic rituals in a way that forced the household to account for me as a living, speaking person, rather than a neat tragedy filed under sympathy. It was a small war of visibility, another kind of instrument. When the physicians left the hall, one of them dropped a small envelope beneath a bench. It was an accident, the sort of thing the careless make and the careful notice. A page boy, distracted, stepped on it. It cracked open in the dust like an unwanted secret. The envelope fell into a servant's hands, and then into the eyes of a guard who had been present for reasons of prudence. He brought it to the general. I watched from the doorway while the general read. He did not do the theatrics of the novels I'd read. He read as if he were measuring weight. The paper in his hand was not a confession, but a banknote, and a name. Miss Lynn. The scribbles were the kind you make when you do not plan to be read. I felt something in my chest loosen and then tighten. This was no deus ex machina. It was the ordinary friction of people moving in ways that reveal other people's work. The general's face did not shift into anger. He was not a man of theatrics. But there was a decision settling there, slow as iron hardening into a blade. He called for a search of Miss Lynn's rooms and ordered the physicians detained for questioning. The household stirred like a thing waking. Guards crossed thresholds with practical efficiency. Ching Shu found me and squeezed my fingers in a touch that was almost a prayer. The search revealed more than one envelope. In a chest behind a screen, they found a physician's ledger with names matched to payments. They found a small bag of coins, heavy with use, wrapped in cloth scented with lotus. They found a list of nights when midwives would be delayed. The evidence was not elegant. It was methodical, matched with money and appointment times. Miss Lynn's gloves were clean of blood but stained in ways that meant deliberate business, whispered favors paid for in the currency of silence. When the general confronted her, she performed surprise so well that a novice might have been fooled. "You mistake me," she breathed. "Why would I harm?" "There is money," the general said, voice low and final as a gate. "There are notes and appointments. You have arranged occasions for privacy. Explain." Miss Lynn's eyes, which had always been a study in curated gentleness, flickered. For the first time since I had met her, there was a fissure in her mask. She tried to retell the narrative she had practiced, care for the household, tenderness toward the child's future. It would have been plausible on 100 other days. But days change when a pattern is drawn across them. Witnesses spoke, servants offered testimony like bread, stale but honest, and the physicians could not easily deny payments. The house did not collapse into melodrama. Instead, it did something more satisfying. It followed procedure. The general ordered Miss Lynn removed from the East Pavilion and confined until the matter could be settled. He insisted on public questioning in the courtyard to leave no shadow where rumor could breed. That the matter was handled by command rather than whispering saved a great deal of ruin. It saved me from becoming a hero or a martyr. It saved me from the kind of false honor stories love but real life rarely bestows. Miss Lynn's banishment, when the sentence was finally given, was not cruel. There was a dignity left in the way the general pronounced it, but it was absolute. She was to be escorted out of the household, sent to a relative's house across the river with nothing save the things she could carry on her back. The crowd in the courtyard watched like it was theater and also law. Servants who had been afraid to speak before now murmured of justice. The house breathed. When the carriage left with Miss Lynn's retinue, There was a small, absurd feeling. I had stepped outside the script and found air. The world was not fixed anymore. People had made choices that did not lead to the tidy tragedy I had read under the sheets in the small hours. The general returned to the East Pavilion with a look that was all measurement and, somewhere under the calculation, something warmer. He lingered in the doorway longer than was necessary and then came to the low table where I sat, the embroidered cloth folded like a promise at my knees. "You were watched," he said, practical as always. "You did well." It was not praise dressed in poetry. It was a recognition that did the job of emotional currency. I felt embarrassingly pleased. "We did what we could," I said. "We worked with what the house would give." He inclined his head. There was a kind of permission in his gaze to be more than an ornament. It did not spontaneously become tenderness, but what it did become was attention. Not the fleeting scrutiny of gossiping eyes, but the weight of a man choosing to notice someone whose life mattered. Protection follows notice. In the arithmetic of households, that is often as much as you can ask for. The months tilled forward in a new rhythm. With Miss Lynn gone, the house slowly rearranged itself into a domestic geometry that favored caution. Physicians were watched now. Midwives kept more careful ledgers. Ching Shu walked the corridors like a quiet general in her own right. The general visited more often, at first for duty, then with a frequency that started to feel less like obligation and more like something like interest. He would linger to ask about supplies, shift a cushion, correct a servant's posture when it risked her comfort. The small things, I learned, are how care accumulates. I practiced tenderness on myself in private, rubbing the belly with a cream Ching Shu recommended, feeling the tiny, relentless kicks like punctuation marks in a sentence I was writing in real time. Parenthood, even when it arrives on a page you never meant to inhabit, is a soft kind of revolution. Decisions narrow into what must be done. More broth, warmer blankets, a list of midwives to call at all hours. My plans for rewriting fate expanded beyond my own survival into a future I had not imagined wanting. I found myself making small offers of comfort, letting someone lift the heavy pot and meeting his surprise with a small, real smile. When he helped, it was practical. My sleeve lifted, a hand on my back, but it was a hand that stayed. Then, one night, the world snapped into a different kind of urgency. It started as a tightening that felt like a belt pulled one notch too fast. I was folding linen when the first wave hit, a pressure that made me go still, breath caught like someone closing a book. The child moved in a way that was unmistakable, a long, urgent flip, and then the ache curved into something else. I remembered with a kind of absurd clarity every labor scene the book had described in ornate sorrow, and decided I would not let the novel write this part either. I called for Ching Shu. She arrived with a calm that felt rehearsed at first and then simply right, the right person for the right job. She had already made a list of midwives who might be roused at night. The house, which had been ordered and quiet, now buzzed with purpose. Lanterns were lit, soft and steady. The midwife arrived with her satchel, breathless but competent. The general was summoned the instant I asked. He came in as if the world were a clock in need of repair. Decisive, not theatrical. His face was calm, a face fit for command. Now his hands had a different job. He folded his sleeves and moved with domestic surety. He gathered linens without fuss. He held buckets. He fetched herbs as the midwife requested. There was no grand speech, only tasks performed with a kind of efficiency that felt deeply personal. The contractions came uneven and then in waves. The midwife gave orders that were not poetry but were life-saving. Breathe as if exhaling a long thread. Push when I say push. Change positions. Press down. Pain arrived with honest cruelty. My world sharpened into the small geography of my body. Sacrum, breath, a child's head bobbing inside me like a small boat I had been steering. I thought often of the ridiculousness. Once I had been a person who fell asleep on the couch who read whole books in one breath. Now I was learning how to bring a human into the world with hands that knew the house's ropes, and a heart that had been polished by fear. There was a moment in the delirium when I wanted to remind myself to be brave, because being brave was the plot. Instead, I breathed and cussed and asked for water, not because bravery requires performative lines, but because rawness needed practical relief. The midwife's voice was a rope of words, tight and anchored. Chingshu murmured encouragements that were stranger and kinder than any line I'd ever read. Small, fierce, utterly unromantic phrases that made me laugh and cry at once. The general stayed. He did not hover in the way of a spectator. He rubbed my lower back with a steady hand, his palms calloused and warm. He spoke little. What he said was efficient. Breathe. Push. Look at me. When I wanted to arch away from pain, he steadied me not by force but by the pressure of his presence. One hand at my shoulder, the other resting near my belly. Once, when the sensation of fear pooled too deep, he pressed a cooling cloth to my forehead and offered a goat's milk wine to steady my hands. That small, quiet care cut through the panic like a blade through gauze. Labor is an intimate violence that also makes room for a kind of tenderness you cannot script. There were contractions that bent me double, and then a pain so vast I thought I might dissolve into the floor. I pushed with a kind of animal logic, 2, then 3 breaths, a long, yielding sound, and then there was a shift, a head crowned like a small, strange moon. The midwife coached. She counted. Chingshu's grip on my hand was a human anchor. The general's face was open in a way it rarely allowed itself to be. Jaw tight, brow knit with concentration that wasn't command but concern. At the last, there was a moment of utter vertigo, like standing at the edge of a cliff and deciding to fall. And then a cry. It was not the end of pain, but it was a sound that changed the architecture of everything. The baby's cry slapped the night awake. The midwife let out a breath she had held for years and declared with the faintest sort of triumph, "A healthy one." They placed the newborn on my chest, slick and small, a fist of life that smelled like something between the world and a clean linen basket. I remember the absurd detail of the baby's mouth sucking at the air like it was already negotiating for milk. I remember the general's hand hovering, then settling over mine on the child's back. In that shape, the 3 of us formed something that was not in the book's brittle pages. A beginning. He was small, with cheeks that made me laugh through tears, and a tuft of hair that lay like a brushstroke. The midwife named nothing. She was practical, feeding, cleaning, noting the sex of the child as if it were a line in her ledger. I felt the room tilt toward joy, not theatrical but honest. The general's fingers, large and steady, found the jade pendant at my collar and then, without asking, unclasped it. He took the pendant, looked at the small stone with an expression that seemed to gather 1,000 quiet admissions, and then pressed it into the newborn's blanket. "It will keep him seen," he said, voice spare but sincere. Seen and known, not hidden. I had not expected him to say it aloud, and yet the statement was exactly the kind of thing that would change scores. To be seen, especially in a world where a child could be erased by gossip or by the quiet machinations of the ambitious, was to exist with an argument hard enough to stand on. In the days after the birth, the house rearranged itself again. New rhythms formed around the child's demands. A cradle was made, soft with the embroidered cloth Miss Lynn had sent, now repurposed into a cloth that held no venom but the vestige of a plan whose edges we had turned. The general began to visit with regularity that was no longer merely ceremonial. He would come with provisions and then linger in small ways, asking if I needed a blanket or if the child preferred a certain angle. He learned quickly how the household ran. He spoke to servants with a courtesy that now carried a protective undertone. We fumbled small domesticities together. Once, when I was up at night with a hungry baby, he brought a bowl of porridge and sank onto the low stool by my side without pretension. "You are better than the woman the book tells me you are," he said once, as if confessing to himself. The comment was awkward but true. He was admitting that my presence had become something that altered his expectations. I laughed. A soft, incredulous sound that tasted like relief. "And I am trying to be better than the book told me to be," I said. "It's a work in progress." We were clumsy and tender in equal measures. He learned to soothe the child by holding him so that the baby could hear a heartbeat that was not mine, and I felt something in my chest uncrumple. Protection had been the strategy. It was becoming affection, a thing that grew like moss in a place with enough damp and shade. Qing Shu was at the center of this small new world, her loyalty now sanctified not only by carefulness, but by the concrete consequence of her vigilance. She took the baby on walks through the courtyard, where guards nodded in respect, and old servants came to touch the tiny toes with reverence. She forbade idle talk and enforced routines. She was less background now, and more like the gravity of the household. Forceful, quiet, vital. Word of the exposure and of Miss Lin's banishment spread beyond our courtyard. People who had been easy to manipulate now spoke more circumspectly. The physicians were replaced with men whose eyes did not stray toward hush money. The small corruptions that had allowed poison to be possible in the margins had been pried out by evidence and command. It was not a perfect victory. There were whispers that Miss Lin had found new patrons. There were nights when I imagined small knives being sharpened across the water. But the shape of our days had altered so thoroughly that my own fear felt less like an impending punch and more like an old scar I could run my fingers over. Over time, something else happened that was not in my plan book at all. Tenderness arrived in the spaces where I had rehearsed gratitude. It came in the way Xin Yan. He had told me to call him Xin Yan once with a half-smile that made his features soften, would watch the child sleep, or the way he left a small bowl of porridge on my table when chores had been long. He did not become sentimental in any caricatured sense. He simply became a man who noticed daily what needed doing and did it. His hands were a kind of apology I had not known I wanted. There was a day when he found me knitting a small cap for the baby, an absurd hobby I had adopted because my hands needed to be busy and because making something seemed like an antidote to being shaped by other people's plots. He took the cap in his hands and examined my stitches with a squint that made me laugh. "It is crooked," he said. "You are supposed to be a general, not a textile critic," I said. He did not smile outright. His mouth twitched into something almost like amusement. "Little things, bent things, are how households live," he said. "A crooked cap does not ruin a life. It makes it ours." I let the image of my previous life, late-night scrolling, solitary apartments with pizza boxes, slide past without nostalgia. Those things had served me once. They felt like a different season when placed next to a warm house and a child whose breath I could count. Rewriting fate had required deception and spectacle, and a certain amount of ruthless honesty. It had also required that I grow a tenderness for the life I had rescued, not because destiny demanded it, but because love, when it arrives in earnest, insists on being fed. Months turned. The child grew into a small, toothless laugh and a hunger that meant work at all hours. He favored a particular way of holding his head that made me suspect a stubbornness that would one day be legend. The general began to teach him small things, how to hold a bowl without tipping, how to walk without being dragged by curiosity. He did so without showiness, with a patience that would have been mocked in a book as too slow to be dramatic. In our quiet world, patience was the most radical tenderness. Sometimes in the hush of the evening when the child slept and the lamps burned low, we would sit quietly and talk, not about the places where the book had written us, but about ridiculous small things. The best way to organize a pantry, the scent that made the laundry smell like spring, the names of herbs the midwife recommended. There were confessions, small, clumsy ones. I told him once that I had fallen into his world because of a midnight binge, and that my first impression of him in the book had been that he looked like someone who would never make time for such nonsense as an embroidered cap. He listened, which in itself was a kind of gift. "You are an enemy I do not like the idea of losing," he said once, as if identifying us both with an odd private allegiance. It was an odd compliment, one of those remarks that take a minute to unfurl into meaning, but I took it as the nearest thing to an admission. We had begun to make new stories together, not because the book required it, but because the life we had built insisted on it. My identity coalesced around stranger and kinder things than the fictional rope that had first bound me. I was no longer merely the protagonist of someone else's tragedy. I was a mother, a strategist, a woman with a history that included a bookshelf, and now a cradle. I learned to answer the small emergencies that come with living flesh. A fever that made the child list like a ship, a night of thunder that bent the curtains into confused waves. I learned the rhythm of compromise, between daring to rewrite fate and keeping the quotidian house rules intact enough that the general's world remained stable. Years are too severe a word for what passed. Months that folded into one another, each stitched with the child's laughter and my growing confidence. Miss Lynn did not return. The river kept its distance, and the house its children. Sometimes I imagined her across the water beginning a new plot. Sometimes I felt only grateful we had used evidence and witnesses and laws to defend what mattered. The world was not sanitized of danger. There were always men who preferred money to mercy. But our household had a new kind of immunity. Attention, documentation, and a man in command who now commanded with a tenderness that was fierce and practical. On the day the child took his first unsteady steps, the general clapped in a way that made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. Smallness had become celebration. The room was full of people who had helped, Ching Shu foremost among them, a small chorus whose voices were not the high notes of novels but the steady harmonies of kin. The child fell into my arms after 3 steps, and then tried again, grinning a grin that I recognized as mine, and also not mine at all. The jade pendant remained a talisman. Sometimes when the house was quiet, I would hold it and think of the night I woke up in a silk bed with a borrowed life and an entire plot still coiled like a snake. I had been terrified then, but terror had been a fuel that made me clever rather than reckless. I had used a novel's tropes against it, visibility against invisibility, gratitude as armor, witnesses as weapons. I had not become someone else. I had taken a role in someone else's book and rewritten the margins until my pen marks held. On a late afternoon, when the sun made the wooden beams look as if they had been washed in gold, the general passed me in the courtyard carrying our child, who kicked a small foot in the air, delighted. He stopped and tilted his head at me with a look that was quiet and honest. "You rewrote your fate," he said. It was not a question. I smiled, and the motion felt like a small victory, a bend in the script that made room for the future. "Not alone," I corrected. "We rewrote it together, with help, with witnesses, with stubbornness." He nodded, a small, private concession to something larger than command. "And you sleep now without doom-scrolling?" I laughed, because it was true and absurd. I read differently now. He watched the child fuss, and then, because gestures matter as laws do, he reached out and tucked a small blanket around the baby with an almost clumsy gentleness that made me ache with a sudden warm gratitude. "Then the world is better for it," he said. "Less rhetoric and more observation." I thought of the title that had first dragged me here in my head, an eye-rolling mental subtitle that read like a confessional. I woke up pregnant inside an ancient romance novel. Now I must rewrite my fate. The truth was messier and kinder than the theatrical line. I had woken in a book and been frightened, yes. I had been clever and deceitful when the plot required it, and honest when honesty was safer. I had learned to use the tools the world provided, laws, public witness, the stubbornness of small-minded servants, and I had watched as a man whose face used to read like a ledger learned how to protect what mattered to him beyond the ledger's numbers. There were costs. I lost the neatness of anonymity, and Miss Lynn's exit left traces of the kind of pain that does not fade. I had to keep vigil in ways I had not expected. I had to learn to be brave for someone else. But the gain was a kind of practical tenderness that made mornings soft and nights confident. Parenthood rewired me. It turned survival into a stewardship. The child in my arms, this small, raw, insolent life, was both my argument and my proof that endings can be edited, if one has the courage to fold margins and write new lines. When people asked later about the story of how I survived, I would give them different answers depending on the light. Sometimes I said it was luck. Other times I said careful planning, lists hidden beneath wardrobes, and the right person reading a ledger. Mostly I say, with less flourish than the books use, that the things that make a life are small and steady and often domestic. A hand on a lower back in pain, a pot warmed for a mother at midnight, a guard who remembers to mark a physician's movements. If you loved seeing how a plot can be hacked, if you enjoy transmigrations where the protagonist takes the pen, I have a playlist of similar stories I devoured, and apparently had the poor taste to become. Follow for more absurdities like mine. Someone will tuck a blanket around you too when the night bites. The seasons continued to shape themselves. The child learned to call the general a name that was simpler than title. a sound rough with effort and sweetness. The general kept his distance in public the way a man of station must, but private moments piled up like stones set in mortar. There were no dramatic declarations on balconies. There was instead 1,000 small actions that accumulated into something resembling love. A hand to steady a step, food brought without being asked, the way he would stand guard at the doorway simply because it felt like the right thing to do. Looking back, the act of rewriting my fate was not a single heroic moment but a collection of choices threaded together by stubbornness and assisted by others who cared enough to act. I learned to love a life that had been forced into my hands by a midnight read, and to protect it with the same patient ferocity the midwife used to bring the child into the world. When I tell this to friends now, people who are prone to binge romances and then wake up with their hearts sore, I tell them the practical parts too. Keep witnesses, keep records, put a servant in your corner. Let gratitude be real and not a performance. Ask for protection and accept it when offered. When the child grew, the house steadied, the general softened in ways that had nothing to do with the trope of villain-turned-lover and everything to do with the quietness of daily choice. We did not escape the world's cruelties, but we built a small refuge within it, where a person who had been written to die instead learned how to live. If you ever find yourself waking in a story that has its ending already typed, remember this. Stories can be stubbornly revised. They require courage, witnesses, and a peculiar kind of stubborn domesticity. They also require tenderness, not the sentimental kind that a writer puts on a line to make a reader cry, but the practical kind that feeds, warms, and watches. In the end, my fate was rewritten not by a single grand gesture but by 1,000 small ones. A bowl left half empty, a ledger read in the dust, a hand pressed to a forehead during labor, a jade pendant clasped onto a blanket. I fell asleep one night years later, in a house that had become home. A child's breathing pinned to my side, a jade pendant cool against my palm. A man who had learned to be present sat with a book he did not always finish. I had once been terrified that an ancient romance novel would define me. Instead, I had learned to write. So yes, I woke up pregnant in an ancient romance novel. And yes, I rewrote my fate. It involved strategy, witnesses, and a lot of soup. It involved a midwife's steady hands and a servant's loyalty. It involved a general whose armor softened into small acts of care. It involved stubbornness and love in equal, unforeseeable measures. If you liked this story, follow for more tales where the protagonist steals their own ending and maybe keeps the pendant. Share it with someone who likes transmigrations, slow burn households, and the quiet revolution that comes when a person decides their story is not finished until they say so.